All right, we're live. Welcome back, everyone, to the Entrepreneur Hour. Today, my special guests are, you see a familiar face in the middle there, PacoZen, and then Ken Byalin. Ken Byalin, so I always talk about how we met. I met Ken Byalin right now for the first time through Paco. So Ken and Paco, if people haven't seen the show before, why don't you each tell your origin stories of what you guys have done separately, and then what you've done together, and then we can talk about what's going on now.
So as a way of introduction to Dr. Ken Byalin, who worked for the state of New York for many, many, many years, my introduction to him is always that when I became a Zen Buddhist priest like 20 years ago, he was already a priest. And my teacher, our teacher, for whatever his reason, lucky for me, asked Ken if he would shave this Puerto Rican's head, because you have to shave the head to become a priest. So Ken and I, who had never really met and kind of were strangers in a way, because he had been there before, and all of a sudden I was coming in, you know, this kid from the South Bronx. So he shaved my head, and I was afraid he was going to cut me, but he didn't do it. So I survived his shaving. That's how we met, and that was the end of the story. I mean, we've been buddies and done a lot of things. And Ken has a background before that in direct action and civil rights. He comes from a background on that, and that's who he is. So this is his hour. So I let him take off.
Oh, I can tell you right off, this is the last place I ever expected to end up, was on an Entrepreneur Hour. I grew up in a suburb. My parents were very committed social activists. That it was a lot of wonderful privileges in my childhood. I got, when I was a young teenager, I got to have dinner with W.E.B. Du Bois at a dining room with like 7 or 8 people. You know, 2 kids.
I never heard that. Oh shoot!
It's like crazy, you know. And I've had that kind of good fortune in a lot of in a lot of ways. But you know, coming out of college, I decided to go to social work school. I basically decided I wasn't going to make any money. I was going to do good.
Are you recording this? Are you recording this, Papa? Miguel, are you recording this? This is history here.
Yeah.
You know, so I basically spent the next 30 years mostly doing social work. In between, I got a doctorate in sociology. I refer to myself as a Johnson scholar. That's Lyndon Johnson. I basically stayed in school and got my doctorate to avoid going to Vietnam. So I credit him with me getting my doctorate. If it hadn't been him, I probably would have just stopped school after social work school. I ended up teaching in college for 4 years, but most of my career was spent in mental health. Most of it working for the state mental health system.
Wow.
You know, where we were caring for the most disadvantaged, probably the most disadvantaged people in the world. Most of the people who end up in the state hospital system are poor. Very high percentage of them are people of color, and they're living with disabilities which are insanely stigmatizing. So you know, there's a few statuses in our society which you can never get rid of. So once you've been in prison, you're an ex-convict.
Yeah.
You know, there's, you know, you're an ex-mental patient. And the movement of people who were living with that stigma kind of, they borrowed a page from you know, Alcoholics Anonymous and other recovery programs, and they talk about being in recovery. I did that for, I was lucky in the sense I got to do a lot of good stuff. I tried to reform the state mental health system without any lasting success. You know, that I found when, you know, even if we'd accomplished something good within a year, sometimes much shorter space of time, you know, the innovation was unraveled. You know, as soon as I moved on, when we had an inpatient adolescent unit, you know, we created a canteen where the kids could cook food, serve food, you know, sell the food, which you know, and it was a huge thing to get that kitchen built on a psychiatric inpatient unit, which probably scared, you know, the commissioners. You know, what's going to happen? What are these kids going to do in the kitchen? And you mean they're going to have knives? It's like, you know, this is insane. But within months after my leaving that job, the kitchen was dismantled. And when I finally had this opportunity to take early retirement, I was feeling, you know, this was like the myth of Sisyphus, you know, who rolls this rock up the hill every day till he gets to the top, and then I go home feeling, you know, at least I did something to make life better for some, you know, kids at that point at a hospital in Brownsville, in Brooklyn, you know, in the midst of the, you know, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, which is, of course, you know, where else would you build a psychiatric hospital? But I'd come in the next day and the rock would be down at the bottom of the hill. And the state came up with this early retirement thing. And it gave me a chance to get out early with a not very good pension, but a chance to get out. So I flew out to California to meet with our teacher Bernie, meet with our teacher Bernie, and he, you know, to see whether he thought it was completely crazy for me to give up my income, because among other things, I was able to send him some money every month for him to do his good stuff, you know. And I don't remember what he said. It was kind of the part of the thing with Bernie. When you asked him a direct question, it was often hard to remember what he said. But
he always said, whenever I brought something up to him, like I showed him my tattoo on my back, and he said, Michiganer. Michiganer, which is Yiddish for, I guess, crazy.
Crazy. But I knew on the plane coming back that I was going to take this early retirement to see where this peacemaker path would lead, and I had no idea. You know, so we tried a couple of things. Paco and I had an organizational consulting business for a while. It was a pretty cool thing that we were facilitating. Paco, of course, was the rainmaker and got us the gigs. And
what was the name of our company?
New Line Consulting.
New Line Consulting. You're creative.
A couple of years ago, I don't know if it's still there, but we were among the people we were affiliated with some folks in Germany who had, New Line Deutsche something, which was the German affiliate. And I came across their website somehow a few years ago, and they have the pictures and bios of all their consultants on their website, like most consulting firms do, And Paco, you and I were up there in Germany. we're still hustling.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
So, Paco tells me you guys are involved in something called social entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Can you guys tell the audience what that means and talk about what it is that you guys do with that?
So we don't know yet what it means. And it's so in talking about it, it's not. And I'll toss out something, I'm sure Paco will too. But that's not drawing a circle to exclude anything. That's giving examples of what's been done, and new ideas for social enterprises are going to come up. I mean, there aren't any old enterprises. There's no going backwards in entrepreneurship. It's what's new. So I think for me, what makes it this minimally a social entrepreneur enterprise is that it's being done to create value for other people.
Mm.
And Paco said to me early on, his mantra in those days was doing good and doing well. It's a little hard for me to wrap my head around. My father always did good and never did well. Fortunately, my mother did pretty well. So he never had to close his business. He could go on not making any money year after year. He made custom furniture, and my mother always knew when the business was doing badly because he'd bring home another piece of furniture for her. And if he had time to make a piece of furniture for her, she knew he had no business. But sort of one of the clients that we ended up with in this consulting practice that we had was one of the state hospitals, the one on Staten Island, that I had worked there for many years, and they brought me back to see if I could train or help some of the current generation of on their management team to do some of the internal entrepreneurship that I had done when I was there, and it didn't work out. It was a new generation, and the current chiefs of service all said, I'm not going to get paid any more money if I do this, so I'm not interested in doing it. So they asked me if I would set up a not-for-profit, work with the hospital that could be a conduit for funding that the hospital couldn't get. And we set out to do that, the mission of leveling the playing field for people living with mental illnesses. Mm-hmm. Pretty early on, Paco became a board member. Not too long after that, he showed up at a board meeting. They were all remote, but he showed up on the phone to say he thought we should take a look at doing a charter school as a way to advance our mission. And that there was a possibility of getting a $50,000 grant to plan this. So I think at that point, the biggest grant that this Marizano Foundation had gotten was $5,000.
Wow.
Yeah, we were really scrambling, and it was mostly, it was mostly me, and I wasn't getting paid much. I mean, a little bit. The hospital was paying me a little bit of money to help do some of this, because we were doing some stuff to help them clean up some messes at the same time. But this $50,000 grant sounded wonderful to me. And I thought, if we could just get this grant, we could spend some time trying to plan a charter school which would level the playing field for kids who are living with emotional challenges. And then we could tell them, we did our best to plan this thing. Sorry, couldn't figure out how to do it. But at least we'd have $50,000, which we could spread over, probably more than a year to sustain a lot of other stuff that we were trying to get started. One of the things that happened, and this is sort of how entrepreneurship works for me, is that you take a step, you try something, you learn more. So as we started talking about the charter school, it became clear almost immediately that this was something that all the Staten Island elected officials, Republicans and Democrats, were eager to get behind. The media was covering. We were getting more attention than we ever got. And we were able to do more in educating people about how vicious the stigma around mental illness is. We were getting more response to that message when we were talking about the school than when we were talking about helping people enter the labor, the job market, get back to work. Particularly back to work. Sometimes people who had never worked. Sometimes people had spent their whole lives in a psychiatric hospital, and it's like a long-term prison sentence. It's hard to get back into the community.
Yep.
But we realized, that this charter school program had legs that we hadn't anticipated, and we ended up getting our first charter. We got the first charter on Staten Island. We opened in 2009 with 75 kids. Paco was the founding chair of the board. He was the only person on our team who had any experience with charter schools at all. And so he was schlepping every month from City Island to Staten Island, which is about the longest possible trip you can do entirely in New York City. And we finished the first year, with some creative bookkeeping over the summer, $47 in the black. But we now have 3 schools open. A 4th school is opening in a year from September. We have over 1,000 students now. When we reach full capacity with the current charters, we'll almost double that. We have an operating, our revenue this year will be over 30 million. Plus the budget, plus the governor cuts it again. Could end up being 20 million. I don't know. I was a couple of years ago. I was invited to join this networking group on Staten Island, which prides itself on being the best business club. Basically, you're largely entrepreneurs, and I went out. I like the guys, mostly guys. It's a little weird. It's mostly guys. It's almost all white. It's a very conservative business community. But I went out for drinks with them, and you basically say, I don't think I belong here. and one of the guys who also then eventually ended up serving on our board for a while said, "Well, I got to tell you, you're running one of the biggest businesses on Staten Island."
$20 a budget is more than most businesses.
Yeah. So here I am on the Entrepreneur Hour. That's how I got here.
That's right.
I think the background on that is that I can't remember when we started that thought that you referred to about starting a charter school. That might have been 2005, 2006. I can't remember that. But before we got the charter, it was rejection, pushback. They did not want, the system didn't want to do that. The educational system would do that. And we knew that in the city of New York, with about 100,000 kids, there is somewhere between 200 or 300 kids that are called special needs. And in those special needs, my opinion is that a lot of these children are misdiagnosed.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these children don't belong in that grouping.
Yeah.
A lot of children do. And a lot of children have a spectrum of illness that goes from kids that sometimes have to be in the hospital 2 or 3 times during the year. I didn't know that hospitals have schools within them just for those kids. There's grammar schools, middle schools, and high schools in hospitals to take care of those kids. I didn't know any of that. We got rejected a lot. It was Ken Byalin's tenacity and his ability to put a team together. Because we say Ken Byalin, Francisco Lugovina, who knew a little bit about charters and being but without a team you can't do this. And it was a team of absolutely dedicated humans who stuck for 3 or 4 years of rejections until we went to charter school. Once we got the charter school, as Ken said, first year is challenging because you got to succeed. And truth be told, as he said, sometimes you don't know what you're doing. You're inventing, you're flying the plane and you're building the wings.
Yeah.
And so to get from there to where we are right now, it's a major, major, major accomplishment, which have helped not only children, but people in Staten Island get jobs. And it has transitioned because, Staten Island at some point, and Ken might disagree with me on this characterization, was a very racist kind of little island. The Verrazano Bridge kind of began to change that a little bit as people came over. I don't remember exactly if our first year was mostly majority Caucasian kids, but I know that's not the reality right now. The reality is probably, 50%, 60% of our kids are people of
85 kids of color.
85%. 85%. So
let me say, Paco, even in the first, this is really interesting. It was like part of the learning for us in this. Probably in the first year, 75% of the kids were Black or Hispanic.
I didn't know that. I thought it was mostly whites.
So they brought
the reason
other brothers brought their kids to Staten Island?
No, they're all Staten Island kids.
All Staten Island.
No, nobody from off island has ever gotten in. Part of the charter school law is that kids who live in the district get first shot at coming into a charter school. Staten Island is all one district. It's geographically. I think there's only one district in Queens which is geographically bigger, and that one is the one that has all the cemeteries in it. So it's this huge plot of Queens, but it's very big. It's diverse, and it's getting more diverse. Learning lesson the first year, and probably the reason that Paco, as the board chair, had the impression that he did was probably 90% of the parents who were active in the PTA in that first year and second year were Caucasian.
That's what I mean.
And
our staff
at the end of the second year, almost all of them left.
Oh wow!
All the children of the active parents left. They spent most of the first year and probably into the second year pushing for a firm discipline, suspension policy,
Oh,
which I think they imagined was going to be used to get the black and brown kids out of the school.
yeah.
And kind of early in the implementation of this policy, probably within weeks after it was implemented, that the daughter of the PTA president managed to get herself suspended.
That's funny.
And they made complaints to the city. They made complaints to the state. We had a hearing with all, the city conducted a hearing at the school, and they didn't find there was any violation of the discipline policy. The discipline policy had been approved, by the board and by the city. It was blah blah blah, But that after that year, almost all of those quote activist parents took their kids out of the school. And the most heartbreaking story in that for me, one of those kids who came in was electively mute. This means even though he had, there was no physical basis for him not speaking.
Something inside. Yeah.
He for psychological reasons, he wasn't talking. And over the 2 years, and of course, that's a consequence. He was really socially isolated. It's hard to make friends if you don't talk. By the end of the second year, halfway, as it got toward the end of the second year, he had friends. He was talking.
Wow.
And his mother shows up to take him out of school. Just like, what are you doing? This is like a miracle in your kid's life, And she says, well, I don't know, last night, the night before, I don't know, we were having dinner or something like that. And he says, yo, Ma. And he says, I didn't send him here for him to learn to talk like that.
Got it. It's crazy, man. This comes, even what's going on right now in the world, right? Like, even though you're benefiting from your son, you still think about that only. That's super interesting. And I have been, Paco, as I work with Paco, he's taught me about charter schools and the business of charter schools. And it's like you said, like in the beginning, I never could see an educational, thing as a business, but it totally is. It's a new model. From what I'm learning is charter schools, if you're watching and you don't understand the difference, I didn't. Charter school and public schools, charter schools are still public schools.
Yes.
They have a little bit more freedom to try things. Where public schools, to try something new in a public school, you have to get it from the top and it has to change everywhere.
Yep.
A charter school can just try something in its own environment and test that out. So you were able to talk whoever into letting you try out a school specifically for kids with needs, with special.
What turned out to be the big argument was that we became convinced in the planning process that a segregated school wasn't going to work any better for kids with disabilities than it works for kids of color. When when I was growing up and the Supreme Court was beginning to close down on segregated schools, there was a black student in Texas who basically sued Texas to get into the law school, which was all white.
They wouldn't let him in just because he was black.
And they wouldn't let her in.
Oh,
So they, but when they lost that in court, and and separate but equal was still the law of the land, they built another law school.
just for black people.
Black kid, one kid,
For one kid. They're like, we don't want. Oh my God, that is interesting. When I saw the name of your school, I thought that was interesting. Like to name it that.
Yes.
That in history, that is frowned upon, right?
Yeah. When we were talking, I mean, it was optimistic. When we started working on the Verrazano Foundation, that was 2000. I think we were probably in a little bit more of an optimistic point. It at least looked to us like significant progress was happening around civil rights. And and then I got this. I've been discouraged for a while. I got encouraging news now, kind of. But we talked about this rights for psychiatric patients maybe being among the last civil rights frontiers. And nobody, at the time, nobody was talking about it. Nobody was even embarrassed. I don't think anybody's embarrassed yet. So by like the difference between 1950 and 2000 is even if white people on the subway got up and moved to another car when a black man got on the train, they were less comfortable admitting that in a social gathering. In 1950, they would brag about it. They were getting embarrassed to say that, but they would say about if a person with a mental illness got on the subway, they wouldn't say I get up and move to another car, and they would say that with the same level of comfort that people talk about a black man getting on the subway in 1950. So you look at where that movement is. When we were talking about integrating kids with emotional challenges and other mental illnesses, they were telling we couldn't do it. We could do a maximum of 15% kids with emotional challenges in the school, or we could do 100%. And they told us we had a deputy commissioner in the New York State Education Department tell us that no person with a disability could be a role model for a person without a disability. And I bit my tongue. I wanted to say in that moment, could you just ask the governor to come in? We had a blind governor then.
Oh, wow!
Right? Yeah.
Wow. That's Patterson, who was black and blind.
I know. Wow.
Yeah. So ask him to. Why don't you ask him to come in? Let him fire your ass.
Well, he was black, so everybody.
Yeah.
They were like, yeah.
But I bit my tongue. And the city advised us, take one of the choices they gave you. Take a 15% limit.
So,
and get your charter. They said you can win it. You can appeal this to the feds and you'll win it because you're right and they're wrong. But it'll take 2 or 3 years. Meanwhile, you get your school open, you begin to serve some kids.
Got it.
we decided we're not going to do the quota. We'll do affirmative. We'll do affirmative outreach. We'll reach out to the organizations, clinics, other kinds of programs where we might be able to reach the parents of kids who are living with diagnoses. And that's what we did, and we ended up with about a third. Turned out to be the sweet spot. We didn't know. We thought we should have 75%. Turned out third, from a business point of view and from an instructional point of view, it turned out to be a sweet spot. All the classes are integrated, all the programs are integrated.
So your population your school population is what percent now?
About 1/3, about 35 to 40%, depending on the school, are kids with emotional challenges. Around 90, I think 75 to 80% poverty, okay. 85% Black and Hispanic.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So it makes sense because as I learn about the education system, I also know that because I also have a son with special needs that was very late diagnosed, right? Even though I was trying to figure it out, and I was active. That the schools make more money for kids that have that, right? So because they have more services they need for them. So it makes financial sense that a school that focuses on that would have a nicer budget to help kids, and then have more services in one place. Would help a lot more kids, because I know, for instance, my son's school doesn't have a lot of services for different kids.
So part of what makes us who we are is we do everything we can using what we call universal design, which is which is sort of like universal precautions when we were dealing with the AIDS crisis. That rather than trying to label this person, so the healthcare staff would do extra precautions with some people and not with other people, and they didn't know who was and who wasn't. And the idea was universal precautions. You just don't handle blood with your bare hands.
Got it.
No matter whose blood it is, put the gloves on.
Yeah, it's kind of like what's going to happen with COVID, right? Like now it's going to be protocol.
You do the temperature thing when somebody comes in. Some people have the temperature, but some people are going to be asymptomatic. You're not going to pick it up, still carrying the virus. So we do it. So this universal design is really non-stigmatizing. So we have a part of our deal is we have a wellness curriculum. Every kid is in a wellness class, 2 periods a week. And we were modeling the program on some of the stuff that had been developed by people in recovery. So like they had a chapter on how do you deal with your symptoms. So we said, well, how are we going to deal with this? Because most of the kids in the school don't think they have symptoms, whether they've been diagnosed or not. Even if the kid's been labeled by somebody, he or she may not think they have symptoms. They just don't like being teased or whatever it is.
Wow.
I don't have an anger problem. This guy has a teasing problem.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But so what we had a board member with us who worked with us in opening the school, who was on the Verrazano Foundation board with us, who was a recovering psychiatric patient. And he contributed this idea of, instead of calling it symptoms, we call it stuff. Everybody's got stuff.
That's good.
Some people have symptoms. Some people have, some kids have parents who fight. Some kids have parents who have substance problems. Some kids
mental health issues too, right? Undiagnosed mental health issues, probably.
Yeah. So it's all everybody's in these wellness classes, and everybody's learning how to handle their stuff. And we all got stuff, and it can either it can derail you or it can make you stronger. and can give you direction. Uh, uh, and that's been part of the challenge for us. We felt in the beginning it didn't turn out to be nearly as difficult. It was, how are we going to convince parents of the quote normal kids to send their kids to a school where a lot of the kids are going to have challenges, and they're not going to be in special classes. They're going to be right in there with your kids.
So this brings me up some questions with my son, right? Like my son has dyslexia. So they told us he was on the autism spectrum. They told us many different things, right? And last year we finally find out he has dyslexia. So we said, all right, what do we do now? What can we do? So we tried to figure out in the school what programs they could bring. Certain things were in the school, certain things weren't. And as a parent now dealing with this, what would you tell anybody watching? You know, they're not we don't live in Staten Island, right?
Yeah.
So the only schools that kind of cater to this are far away. And he got into a good school because I had a meeting with the principal. The principal said his grades are way better than most kids with a problem.
Yes.
So you're going to have trouble having the DOE give you extra help. So it's like a weird situation where he definitely needs more help. He's not getting enough help, but he's above the level somehow.
So those are your child is kind of the paradigm kid that we created these schools to help. Kids who are different have a hard time in school, particularly in middle school and high school. As hard as it can be in elementary school, it tends to get worse.
I know.
High school age kids have an enormously low tolerance for difference. I mean, they're all so insecure. We all were, we all spent most of our adolescent years, looking around to see what other people were doing before we volunteered, stuff like that, So, if you have difficulty with that, you're going to have some difficulties. Are they strengths or weaknesses? One of my favorite writers on autism in the spectrum is Temple Grandin, and my favorite line is she says, if it wasn't for people on the spectrum, we'd still be living in caves.
I actually think some of that, right? I feel like I am on some kind of spectrum. My brain is definitely different, right? But it's like, whatever. I think most entrepreneurs are on some kind of spectrum. I really do. I do think it's like the ADD career.
Yeah, but it's part of the thinking. It's part of thinking outside the box. Me too. So we have an advantage. People who, are quote normal, it's very hard for them to think outside the box.
Be creative, right? Yeah.
For those of us who live outside the box, and most of the time we're trying to pass for people who live inside the box. Thinking outside the box, comes easily, but it cuts two ways. So Paco talked, about my persistence, in getting the first charter. Some of that, and I'm happy to call it persistence. It's kind of normalizing. But part of it is, on one, is that I've built up this, in one way, kind of an insensitivity to rejection. But that's a two-edged sword, because the way in which I built up that insensitivity to rejection is by being rejected. So on the one hand, I can kind of be insensitive. I don't really care, whether you actually like me or not. just want you to give me this charter because I want to help these kids. On the other hand, you know, when this racist parent takes her kid out of the school, who has gotten so much from being in the school, I don't feel badly just for that kid, you know. You know, I feel bad, you know. I mean, how 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 is it? You know, I feel this. I didn't say it. You know, it's like, you know, because I've learned another thing, you know. But I feel, you know, like with what all we've done for your kid and your family, how can you be so unappreciative? Because I really want you to accept me, you know. You know, so it's you know, so when you're outside the box, you pay a price for being outside the box. You know, and the challenge for these kids is to, and for us, you know, it's a lifetime thing. It's not just you deal with it as a kid and then you're done. You know, is that you learn somehow to digest the pain so that you can appreciate the gifts. And and I think learning to appreciate your gifts helps you digest the pain.
So that's kind of what I'm trying to teach him now. I'm trying to show him people with dyslexia that have done well, but he has multiple things. So it's like you also don't want to compare. You just don't know what he will do,
Yeah.
right? So part of me is just like, look, let's just figure out what's going to work for you. And I'm going to do my best as a parent to make sure you get as much services as possible. But he's going into junior high school now, so I am a little worried. But you know, I wish there were a school like yours in the Bronx. Is that your goal, to create one in each borough?
Well, that's a great entrepreneurship question. Even before we opened the first school, people started telling us we should do that.
Makes sense.
And we did, part of the reason we didn't act on it, I realized a couple of years later, was I was exhausted. I thought of spending all my time in the car, going from borough to borough. You know, so it was when somebody, and it was a lawyer, it was one of our pro bono corporate lawyers, you know, suggested that we just grow the charter sector on Staten Island. That opened up a pathway to grow.
All of your schools are on Staten Island? They're all on one
Yes,
level?
yes.
Okay.
You know, you know, right now there are no more charters for New York City.
Oh, no
new
more
schools. You know, for me, like the really negative side of the blue wave, you know, that swept Albany, you know, 2 years ago, is that it's an anti-charter majority in both the Assembly, which it's been for a while, but now also in the state Senate. So it's a much less hospitable environment for charters in New York State now than it was.
Why is that? Because part of me, I always want to understand, and anybody watching that wants to be in the education space, why is it that there's such a division of people and don't?
You know, I can. Paco knows more about politics than I do, but I'll tell you. I think it's a very complicated thing for people in the Democratic majority. You know, and you know, particularly for the people in the Assembly and the Senate who represent 4 districts, which I guess is most of the Black and brown elected officials come from 4 districts. And these tend to be districts where there tend to be charter schools, and the parents are choosing charter schools in their districts. At the same time, that Democratic majority gets a lot of political support from the UFT. And the UFT sees charters as a threat. I don't think it's a threat to public education, but most of the charter schools are not unionized. There's no particular, if they ever did unionize, there's no particular reason they would necessarily be UFT schools. And right now, I guess I don't know how much it's changed as a result of the Supreme Court decision last year, but basically if you work in the deal where you pay dues to the UFT, and I think we're at a point now where somewhere north of 16% of the kids are in charter schools. The city schools are still overcrowded.
16. Wow, that's pretty high.
But 16% of the kids are in charter schools, and they're there because their parents have chosen it. Nobody is sent to a charter school. It's Committee on Special Education can't send your kid to a charter school. Nobody can send your kid to a charter school. You as a parent choose it, and the day you decide you don't want your kid in the charter school, you can take your kid out of the charter school and enroll them in a district school. Period. It's absolutely under the parents' control. But 16% less dues paying teachers is a 16% cut in revenue potentially for the UFT.
Okay, got it. Makes sense.
So I think just on that level, I don't think this. Clearly we're not taking. I speak for. We're not creaming. Whatever grade we're taking kids in at, our kids were underachievers in their previous public school. No parent takes their kid out of a school in which he or she is thriving.
Yep.
Well, maybe there's a couple of people who politically want to support charter schools. So I'm taking my kid out of the school in which they're doing well, and I'm going to send them to a charter school. But those are very rare. It's almost always because the kid is not doing well. He's not learning. He hates to go to school. Whatever the story is.
I think I'm like in this area because we deal with at Meadowbrook. We deal with private schools, public schools, charter schools. I think there should be a kind of like a lab environment that tries things where the DOE can't really do that. So that's what does make sense about charter schools. But I understand now why they would be upset because you're taking part of their budget. But if something's not working as entrepreneurs, you got to change it, right? Like if the kids are not working and it's not working in those environments, something has to give.
I mean, it's a very complicated world, So, the UFT has an antagonistic position toward charters, but in the system with 1.1 million kids, this huge bureaucracy. Without the UFT, teachers would have no voice at all.
Yeah, they need it. Yeah, that's true.
So part of the dilemma is you've created this monster bureaucracy, in which the only people really who have any voice are the people who are sitting at the top of the Department of Education and the people who are sitting at the top of the UFT. And that's the room where it happens. And if you create a committee and you have 6 parents, out of the 1 is a million parents, 2 million parents, whatever the number is. Maybe it's 1 million parents. Maybe a lot of parents have more than one kid in the school.
Sure.
So something like 1 million parents. Parents have no voice.
That's true.
I mean, I saw in the paper a couple of weeks ago that Rhodey McCoy died. I don't know if any of you remember that name, but Rhodey McCoy was the school administrator for the Ocean Hill-Brownsville School District when New York City did its experiment with community control of the schools. and when they took over, and Rhodey took over as the administrator, one of the things that they were able to do was they could transfer out of the schools teachers who they didn't want there. It was almost all black kids. Remember this? Okay, so they transferred out nine white teachers out of the whole district. 9 teachers. They were all white. And in that year, which I guess was something like 1967, that was considered outrageous racism. If they had transferred, 5 black teachers and 4 white teachers, then people say, "Oh, this is okay," I guess, right? Something like that. Now that logic from 1967 doesn't make any sense today. It's like, here in this, Black Lives Matter moment, if someone were to say, look, if you're going to get rid of the bad apples that they call them, right? We should get rid of an equal number of black bad apples and white bad apples. Today that doesn't compute at all.
Crazy. It's a crazy time. So we're up against the end of it. Paco or Ken, any last words for anybody watching about education or just anything? I know you guys are not only educators, and you're in the Zen Peacemakers as well. Anything actually, this could be good. Entrepreneurs right now, and many people actually right now, maybe facing mental health issues, dealing with being home, being alone. What would you tell someone right now in that headspace?
One of the things that I would say is that one of the things that particularly white America is learning now, and you would think that it would have been learned over so many hundreds of years now, 250 years of slavery and Jim Crow and stuff like that. It's the fact that being black and being brown is a particular state of being. That it's not an adjective. He's brown, that's descriptive. He's black, that's descriptive. Blackness is not necessarily color. It's a state of being which you walk around with you from the day you're born to the day you die. And so you could be a multi-billionaire, and you get in your car and the cop stops you. Mm-hmm. You can't say, "My name is billionaire Paco." The cop would say, "Fuck you." Keep your hands on the wheel. So most Caucasian people have no experience of that at all. And the result is that there is a lot of misinterpretation about what that is and what that represents in terms of suffering for people. I think that we're beginning to see a little bit of light in that perspective, as you saw so many Caucasian kids in demonstration. There was some demonstration that had more white kids than blacks, and all over the country. And so I'm hopeful that that's going to be some kind of a change or a path to a wider discussion and conversation. The thing that we were talking about before is to be an entrepreneur is almost like that state of being where you always have an uncertain sense that anything can happen. The surprise will happen any moment in your life. It's almost like life itself, And entrepreneurs and people with mental health and people who are discriminated against live in what I call soft ground. Our ground is never solid. I have never lived in a place in my life, and not mean place, but a state of being where things have been solid. My ground is always moving. And, like Ken says, that's a place that sometimes is not comfortable. And I don't intend to romanticize that at all.
That's true.
But yet you live in a place where you become very creative. you become very vulnerable to a lot of things, including the amount of rejection that one gets. It's almost like being a salesperson, where they say you have to get 100 no's before you get a yes.
Yep.
And so I think we're living at a place and time where more kids are going to say, I don't want to go work for corporate America. I don't want to work for corporate America. I want to be in a place where I can march to my own drum beat. How do I do that? So that's I'm being taught in schools. How do you march to your own drum beat? How do you go into a place where perhaps it's dark and there's very little light, but you can create the light by going into it. I think that's the kind of work that Ken has particularly pioneered with the school. A teacher pioneered it with the Greyston Foundation and other things. And now Ken and I and another Dharma brother are talking about exploring that territory. We come at it with a sense of having experienced it, but still not knowing it. Which is what Ken was talking about when you asked him the question, what is social entrepreneur? We experienced it, we've done it, we've flown it, but we still don't know what it is. It's almost when you saying to me, explain to me Zen. What is Zen? The moment that I open my mouth, it isn't. So, anyway, those are my thoughts that I think that this interview with Ken probably should be almost like a series of 3. Like maybe Ken comes back in a couple of months from now, because we're going to go through some incredible changes in the next few months.
Sure.
I mean, huge changes. And in 6 months, that's going to be even more changes into January 21. So maybe in the fall, Ken comes back and maybe comes back in January. And we make this like a series of conversations with him and with me, because we're still we get very excited. By the way, we have fun doing a lot of this shit. We laugh a lot. Paco curses a lot. Ken doesn't. Paco's favorite word is that F word. So yeah, that's my take, and I'm so happy that Ken came on.
Me too.
Thank you.
Ken.
So have the last word, Ken.
I'll tell you my optimistic anecdote for the spring. 2 years ago, Eric Garner was killed on Staten Island.
Staten Island.
And a lot of people were upset. And there were some demonstrations, and they were almost all black. After Floyd was murdered, there were a lot of demonstrations on Staten Island. The largest demonstration on Staten Island was in Tottenville. Tottenville is the whitest community on Staten Island.
Wow.
Unbelievably, in this day, so many years after the school desegregation decision, there are 2 elementary schools in Tottenville which are 100% white.
Wow.
They're the largest anti-racism demonstration this spring on Staten Island was in Tottenville.
Mm.
And
That's a very interesting name, isn't it? Cottonville?
Totten.
I thought it was cotton, but cotton. I said, oh my God.
That's a Dutch thing, But the majority of the marchers were white.
That's good. I think so too. I think this Floyd thing, it's messed up, and so is COVID. But I think it's changing the world for the better. Hopefully, I think it is. So
yeah, but I think both of these things, both COVID and the Floyd murder, are going to lead to some lasting changes, and there's going to be a big push, to go back to normal. And it's complicated.
One thing it made me think about when you said I didn't want to be going back and forth to these schools. Now that everybody's so comfortable with video conferencing, maybe now that's more possible.
Yes. And you know, what Paco and I have talked about, you know, so if there are entrepreneurs in the Bronx who want to open a charter school, possibility is to open one across the border in Westchester, because there are still charters available upstate.
So Paco has been talking to us at Meta Bronx, the same way probably he's been talking to you about maybe creating a charter school where we're still just trying to survive like you were back in those days. So
Yes.
it might happen one day, just like your thing worked. Paco may have another one on his
Yes.
head. Hopefully, we'll see. But thank you guys. Thank you both for coming on. I know it was last minute. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Looking forward to continuing the conversation and talking more.
One note. Ken, Miguel sent you another email to see if there's any kids in your school that's willing to come to Meta Bronx for the Entrepreneur program.
Okay.
It's online. So you got an email from him. And it could be 3 kids, it could be 5 kids, it could be 20 kids.
You know, I think there may also be a couple of staff members who might want to figure out a way of hooking up with you.
Okay, yeah, connect because we need mentors too. So amazing. Thank you.
We have a couple of staff who, you know, are talking about that's something that they would like to do. I mean, I think they're thinking on, you know, how to do it on Staten Island. Maybe figure out a way. Hope you get a charter school going in the Bronx. And you can help us get mentoring going in Staten Island.
Yeah, let's try. Let's try for sure. We want to expand just like you. So maybe we partner and bring Meta Bronx to Staten Island, and vice versa. Very cool. Thank you very much.
You.
Both of you guys have a good weekend. Be safe.
Thank you. You be safe too. Everybody stay safe.
All right.
Thank you.